Does a completely new set of SOPs exist after 9/11? Meaning we can't use today's standards to judge things from 25 years ago?
We all know that before 9/11, flying in the US was as simple as taking a taxi or a bus. You just show your driver's license and board.
Airport security wasn't that strict back then. You could even bring a Swiss Army knife on board. But that all changed after 9/11.
Then there's the issue of cockpit door security, which also became extremely strict after 9/11.
Flight travel, which used to be very relaxed, where people were at ease and joking around, turned into an environment where everyone has a sour face and feels tense when they get to the airport. Honestly, after more than 20 years, I don't think that has changed.
Whenever I think about flying domestically within the US, not international flights, just domestic ones, it gives me a headache.
Flights are often delayed, or it's summertime now, and you get these thunderstorm cells in places like New York or Chicago. I remember one time in Chicago, our plane had already taxied onto the runway, but we watched from a distance as a thunderstorm cell got closer and closer. In the end, we had no choice but to head back to the gate. We couldn't take off. Of course, that led to total chaos for the flights. In fact, we were only a few minutes off. The planes ahead of us had already taken off.
This situation rarely happens in Australia or Taiwan.
In Taiwan, flight issues are usually caused by typhoons, and because typhoons last longer, it's easier to assess which days' flights might be affected.
Anyway, regarding yesterday's discussion about the small plane hitting the Zoom Tower, the tallest building in Beijing, was it serious?
You only need to look at the subsequent reaction from the CCP to know that this was a very serious incident.
So, moving back to Ukraine, today's headline is about how Russia is actually running short on oil, and Putin's situation is getting worse. Has the tipping point arrived? Because if we run a war game, there are 4 scenarios. One is that Russia's economy gets so bad and the tide of war turns, forcing them to surrender or resort to nukes. That's one possible outcome. Another is that both sides become so exhausted that they accept a temporary ceasefire agreement, similar to North and South Korea, rather than a permanent peace.
That seems more likely. The third possibility is simply a continued war of attrition, with Russia slowly making minor gains and Ukraine continuing its long-range strikes, but without any major breakthroughs, thus dragging out the negotiations.
This seems to be the most likely scenario at the moment, so it could potentially drag on until 2027 or even longer. As for the fourth scenario, it currently seems quite unlikely. The fourth scenario is that Russia suddenly gets a massive boost, manages to push forward successfully, and causes Ukraine to collapse, which would effectively mean a Ukrainian surrender and a settlement. This possibility is extremely low, because the reality is that if Russia had been able to knock out Ukraine immediately, the war likely would have ended in the very first month of its first year.
In fact, Russia has advanced very slowly, and its logistical supply lines are extremely serious and fragile. So the issue we want to discuss today is this problem of its fragile logistical supply. First, let's look at why Putin wanted to launch this war in the first place.
The war began on February 24, 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
However, back on February 4, 2022, on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics, Putin traveled to Beijing under that pretext to meet with Xi Jinping. And after meeting with Xi Jinping, the two sides issued a joint statement declaring that the relationship between China and Russia has no limits, no upper bounds, and no ceiling. And in that statement, they criticized NATO's eastward expansion, which was effectively laying the groundwork for this war. In other words, under whose encouragement did Putin launch the war against Ukraine? Xi Jinping. We could almost say that this campaign was a test, especially to see how the United States would react to Russia's invasion. After all, back in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, the United States took no action, and Ukraine made no response, so it was just swallowed up. There are two extreme possibilities. One is that the United States and European NATO countries do nothing, which would naturally be the greatest encouragement for Xi Jinping. He would then take the opportunity to invade Taiwan, as their two narratives are the same, that it has belonged to them since ancient times, even though this narrative is flawed and problematic.
The other extreme is that the United States and NATO intervene in the Russia-Ukraine war, tying down US and NATO forces.
In that case, Xi Jinping could likewise to attack Taiwan.
And if they were to increase operations in the Middle East as well, effectively distracting the US on two fronts, then in Xi Jinping's mind, Taiwan would be his for the taking, and it would be very easy. In other words, this is why the Hamas terrorist attack happened in 2023. The CCP had already made it clear that they intended to use 3 regional conflicts to pin down the United States, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, and a third where North Korea would further constrain the U.S. on the Korean Peninsula. However, things didn't go as planned. Kim Jong-un failed to unify Korea, so a war on the peninsula didn't break out. Israel launched a strong counteroffensive, and more importantly, Trump won the 2024 U.S. election. Thus, the U.S. is back in 2025, not only changing its role in the Ukraine conflict, but also intensifying its actions in the Middle East. Looking at the big picture, peace in the Taiwan Strait is constrained by multiple forces, one of which is the Russia-Ukraine war. But does Putin now feel deceived by Xi Jinping regarding the Russia-Ukraine conflict? He has not spoken about this publicly. But since Xi is worried about secondary sanctions, because Russia is under sanctions, and if you support or provide military aid to them, you will be hit by these sanctions. So to prevent being hit by secondary sanctions, and because his own economy is in a downturn, he cannot fulfill the promise he made in 2022 that there are no limits and no ceilings to China-Russia cooperation. Of course, Xi Jinping could also say, "We agreed back then that you would achieve a quick victory, that you would take Kiev and topple the government within days or weeks. But look at it now. So how can you blame me for not supporting you? Your war on the Western Front has dragged on, which prevents me from taking action in the Taiwan Strait. And the problem is even worse now. Your army's progress on the front lines is so slow. Recent figures even show that you are losing territory you had already occupied. Conversely, Ukraine is achieving great success. They are now using long-range strikes to hit your oil refineries all over Russian territory, with an attack success rate of over 30%. The flames of war are no longer just in Ukraine, but deep inside the Russian rear. And how serious has the problem become? Now, Russia, an oil-producing nation, is starting to face an oil shortage. Why is there a sudden shortage of oil? And Russia occupied Crimea, which is of course the greatest achievement Putin claims for his political legacy and his military campaign. So between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, there is the Kerch Strait, where the Kerch Bridge was built. This bridge, also known as the Crimean Bridge, serves both rail and road traffic, making it the primary route for all logistics and supply chains. But precisely because this bridge is so vital, it has now become a prime target for attacks. While the global focus was on the situation in Iran, everyone suddenly realized that Russia might be on the verge of losing Crimea, a possibility that no one had anticipated before. This shift happened over the course of just a few weeks, as Ukraine launched a series of devastating strikes against Crimea and the bridge, yielding remarkable results. Russia has now declared a state of emergency on the Crimean Peninsula, and a large number of Russians are fleeing the region. Given current trends, as Russia withdraws a large portion of its air defense systems back to its own territory, its control over Crimea is inevitably growing weaker and weaker. From NASA's aerial imagery, we can see that the air defense missile sites deployed by Russia in Crimea have also been targeted. The red dots represent the points of attack, which were also captured as locations where fires broke out. Furthermore, international analysts have observed that from January to June of this year, 2026, the frequency of Ukrainian attacks on Russian targets surged dramatically in June. Reaching a peak, nearly 30% of the attacks launched by Ukraine have been successful. Commentators are questioning how a nuclear superpower— and who is this nuclear superpower? It is Russia, whose self-defense capabilities have proven to be surprisingly poor. Looking at this ratio, it is truly worse than that of Israel. However, there are contrasting statistics. Any Reports, which specializes in covering the Russia-Ukraine war, also provides a great deal of analytical data. They analyzed that overnight, Ukraine shot down 82 out of 108 drones sent by Russia. So why is Russia so weak? This point may be related to Taiwan, because the main heart and electronic systems of Ukraine's drones come from the Taiwanese supply chain, making this a global relay race. The key to achieving this turnaround is something Ukraine